Okay, so I should start with an information. The meeting is being recorded, so smile. Welcome, everybody. It's absolutely lovely to meet you today. My name is Agnieszka Kohls, and I'm here hosting this webinar and helping our wonderful presenter, Melissa Hahn, who is an intercultural trainer and will today raise the atmosphere, I guess, a few degrees with what she has to say. So just few information. You obviously know how to use the chat because people are participating and we see the comments. So if during the webinar you will be having any questions, you either can ask it via chat or you can ask it via Q&A option. All the options you should have in your computer on the lower bar. If there are any technical difficulties, you can write me in the chat and I will try to help you solve it. But maybe before we start, I should ask if there is any issue right now. Linda, I see you are raising a hand. So could you say is there anything you want to ask or?
Hello, I'm Linda, talking from Edinburgh. I'm not familiar with this particular layout. Should I be seeing it Zoom format or should I just be seeing you?
You should be seeing us and the presentation. So the question is if you do.
I can certainly see you.
Okay. So you can, you are on the computer or are you on the phone?
Computer.
Computer, PC or Mac?
Yeah, the Mac.
Mac. Okay, and are you going through a website or do you have the Zoom app?
I'm going through the link that was on the SIETAR invitation. I do have my own Zoom, but I just went through the link. And so it does look different. That's my question.
Okay, because you should, if you have your own Zoom, you should be transferred to your own Zoom platform and then it should pop up. But then you can, when you go to the bar, you can manipulate with what you can see.
Yeah.
So you can then change it and maybe change it to the view that is not only concentrated on us, and you have those options. Yeah, you have the options on. It depends on how you have your either up above us or you have it on your left, depending how your screen is set. But you will see a little line, a square, then two squares, but you know, little little boxes, etc. Yeah, you've managed.
Review. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So I guess if that's all, it should be okay to start. So Melissa, over to you.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Melissa Hahn, and I am so pleased to be with you today to talk about U.S. cultural values and our 2020 presidential election. I'd like to start by saying thank you to Agnieszka and the SIETAR Europa virtual events team for hosting today's event. And I would really like to thank all of you for just taking time out of your mornings, afternoons, and evenings to be with us today. Now, of course, the nature of webinars is that I can't really see any of you, but I'm very curious to get a little bit of a feel for your perspectives, especially those of you who are thinking about the US election from overseas. So Agnieszka is going to help me start off with a poll, and I'm very curious to see whether anything perplexes you about our election process, and if so, what one is the answer. So is it our never-ending election cycle? The way that we count our votes, that we only have two main political parties, our extreme partisanship, or everything about it. On the other hand, if you feel that nothing about it is perplexing, you can also choose that option. And I believe you can choose as many options as you want. Is that correct, Agnieszka?
Yes, it's multiple choice, so
Yes.
go vote.
While you're voting, or while you're making your selection, I'll say that for those of you who aren't familiar with the Electoral College, it is the system by which we tally the votes. In the US, we don't have a system where one person gets one vote and we just look at the total to see who wins. The votes are allocated at the state level, and each state is essentially worth a certain number of points, if you want to think of it that way. And so the candidates are competing to see how many states they can win. And we could have a whole different webinar about all the ins and outs of that, but that's the Electoral College. Looks like we have almost everybody voting.
84%.
Oh, if you say nothing about it, nothing is perplexing. Maybe just make your final vote. Okay.
We're approaching. So, yeah.
Looks like we have people who are voting on the second one as well. So who do you hope will win? Is it Joe Biden, Donald Trump? Maybe you don't see much of a difference, or maybe you would really like to see another term for Obama. Unfortunately, if that's your choice, I will say that we have term limits in the US, and so that's not a possibility, but I do know that there was a lot of enthusiasm for him, especially overseas.
The number of votes is not changing, so I guess I'm going to end the polling.
Okay,
because
perfect.
It seems whoever could voted. Okay. So this is what.
All right, so on number one, the winner was how we count our votes, and that is our complicated electoral college system. And it looks like the runaway favorite for participants in this webinar is Joe Biden, although we do have a couple of people who say that they would like Donald Trump or that they don't see much of a difference. Okay.
We have even alternative suggestions like Michelle Obama.
Oh, okay.
And option number 5.
So even within the intercultural field, we have a diversity of opinions. In today's presentation, we are going to look at 4 key values that Americans live by, as identified by L. Robert Kohls in a speech that he gave to the Washington International Center. Now, I chose Robert Kohls because I thought he might be somebody who's less familiar to you. We certainly could have done the same presentation using the models by Hofstede or others, but Robert Kohls was speaking about American values for an American audience. And since the US election is really all about Americans for the American audience, I thought using his language could be a useful starting place for understanding us. Now, to be honest with you, if I were to assert to my fellow Americans that we had values that were consistent and that we had in common and that were shared across the geographic and political spectrum, I think that their reactions would be dismissive or incredulous, maybe even a little bit angry. People on the left would probably accuse me of making some kind of false equivalency. And so I want to explain a little bit about the argument that I'm going to be making.
Melissa,
yes.
Just cut in for a second. There is a request for speaking a little bit slower.
Okay. Thank you.
Some people are not native in English.
Sure.
And they would like to, yeah.
Okay, certainly. Is the volume okay though? Okay. So we have these 4 key American values. And even though there are many differences of opinion about how we should interpret and enact these values, the values themselves are really not disputed. Nobody in the US is arguing that we should be less informal or that we should be more indirect. The values themselves are really, I think, consistent. And I'm going to illustrate that in a couple of ways. I'm going to use some examples from celebrities. Now, normally I would not bring celebrities into a serious conversation, but when it comes to American political culture, we already have a celebrity of sorts in the White House. Of course, Donald Trump had a reality TV show. And so celebrity culture and political culture certainly overlap here. I also think that celebrities are able to connect with something very central in the American psyche. If they could not make this connection, they wouldn't be popular. So let's take a look at each value and see if we can start to identify some patterns. The first value that we'll look at is equality. And L. Robert Kohls notes that in our founding documents as a country, we have an assertion that all people are created equal. In the United States, there is in general a very strong aversion to treating people of a high position in a deferential manner. So we are exactly the opposite of what you might see in China. If somebody is in a higher position than I am, I do not owe them anything in terms of the way that I behave towards them. I can give you a short personal example of this value. When I went to Poland for graduate school, I was telling my grandmother this news that I was going to be leaving, and I wanted to try to find some way that I could make this university in Poland have some kind of relevance for her, because she had never been to this country and didn't know very much about it. So I told her that my university was the same one where Copernicus and Pope John Paul had been students. Well, my grandmother is originally from Oklahoma in the middle of the country, and she said in her own words, well, bully for them. And in American English, this really meant, I don't care who they are. I don't care what they did. She wasn't impressed at all. That was not a way to make this relevant for her. And I think that this attitude of, I'm not impressed with you, I don't care about you and how important you think you are, is a part of our understanding of equality in the US. Our first quote about equality comes from one of our celebrities, Oprah Winfrey. And she says, "It does not matter how you came into the world. What matters is that you are here." And this illustrates the idea of equality as a kind of inherent or innate human universal value. A different idea of equality comes to us from the actor and activist George Takei. And he says, the arc of our history is toward more equality being expanded to more and more people. And this illustrates the idea of equality as legal rights. So if we have this shared value of equality, one of the challenges that we have is that the value is not being fully lived out and realized in real life. The United States right now, according to economic measures, is becoming more and more unequal. And this really presents a profound challenge for Americans, because there is a growing gap and growing divide between our ideals and the reality that we're actually living in. This has led to differing interpretations about why this has happened and how the problem should be solved. There are two competing narratives about who is the little guy. The little guy is the hero, the ordinary American that the system should defend. On the right, which tends to be right now more populist and more nationalistic, more closely connected to traditional values, the president has set himself up as the defender of a very specific slice of our demographics. His supporters tend to be white, especially men, people who don't have a college degree, people who feel like they've been left behind by globalization, and also who feel that they've been left behind by our changing culture, by Hollywood, and by increased diversity. In their interpretation, the villain is immigration. It's why is our society changing? They blame China, and they also blame regulation. There's a very deeply rooted American idea that if we're all equal, we need the government to get out of our way so that we can all flourish. On the left, there's a very different interpretation. Historically, the left supported labor and farmers, and to some extent, they are still trying to do that. But they also have expanded their focus to include civil rights in a legal sense for Americans from all different backgrounds, especially groups that have been marginalized or excluded. So we think about African Americans, we think about people who are gay or lesbian or transgender, people who are undocumented immigrants who don't have a legal right to work in the US. And in that sense, their interpretation of the villain is often big business. Will complain about Wall Street, will complain about also systems, systemic racism, historical patterns of exclusion. And this side of the aisle thinks that the government's role in making life fair is not about getting out of the way. It's about becoming much more activist in telling people what they can and cannot do. So this is one example about how a shared value looks very different depending on what political perspective and what identity you have. Agnieszka, is the pace okay? Okay.
Sorry, I forgot I am mute. Nobody's complaining, so I'm assuming.
Okay.
Perfect.
So equality is probably one of our most difficult values because there is such a gap between our expectations and our experience. Informality is not really that stressful of a value for us to discuss. Robert Kohls argues that Americans are one of the most informal and casual people in the world, and that we consider informality as a compliment. In general, we really want people to be comfortable. Two images we can use to illustrate this are Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. Steve Jobs frequently, almost exclusively, appeared in his black turtleneck and his jeans. Mark Zuckerberg, at least previously, often wore jeans and a sweatshirt jacket or a hoodie. And this is very, very different from what you would see by executives in, say, Japan or China.
Or Poland, for that matter.
Or Poland, yeah. Our first quote about informality comes from the actress Selena Gomez. She says, "Some people probably think actresses dress up everywhere they go. I'm in sweatpants half the time with my hair in a ponytail." Now, I don't know if this is true or not, but what I can get from this quote is that it's important to her that she projects an image of being casual, relaxed, and relatable. A lot of different articles about celebrities are often on the topic of how they are just like you and me, even though clearly their lives are very different. And informality is the doorway that famous people or important people can walk through in order to keep their connection with ordinary Americans. A completely different interpretation of informality comes from Lady Gaga, who is known for her exotic, just wild costumes. And she says, "I like pushing boundaries." This gets at the idea of informality as breaking the mold, being original. She is refusing to constrain her own self to any kind of rules that somebody else has put in place. She is going to live her life according to her own internal creativity. So let's look at what this, how this impacts politics. We have two pictures of former presidents, George W. Bush from the early 2000s and Bill Clinton from the 90s. I would argue that even though they came from different political parties, they were both masters of projecting informality. Bill Clinton famously wore his Ray-Ban sunglasses and played the saxophone on a late night entertainment show. This was a way to show, especially young voters, that he was cool. He's not stiff, he's not uptight, and that there's a real person behind the politician and the suit. George W. Bush, I don't think anybody would argue necessarily that he was cool, but he had an everyman demeanor that was enormously appealing to a lot of people. He came from a family that was wealthy. He was obviously part of a political dynasty, but he was able to transcend that by talking about going to his ranch, which is kind of a farm for cowboys. He was very comfortable with ordinary people, and he had an attitude and a demeanor that came across as being down to earth and relatable. And one of the big issues when he ran for re-election in 2004 was centered on this character called Joe the Plumber. And Joe the Plumber was a real person. His name was Joe, and he was a plumber. But he kind of stood in for what the ordinary person would want. And there was a lot of conversation about who would you rather have a beer with, George W. Bush or his opponent. Notice that the conversation was not about who is more competent or who is more qualified. The emphasis is really on this question of who seems like me. Now, most Americans probably know that who seems like me is just a proxy or a shortcut for evaluating the qualifications of the candidate. But the cultural reasoning is that probably this person is never going to meet me, and they can't really fully comprehend the challenges that I have in life. But if they feel uncomfortable around ordinary people, maybe that's a bad sign that they are even more disconnected. So informality is a way to show that they are clued in and that they get it. A third value for us to consider is directness, openness, and honesty. And L. Robert Kohls asserts that Americans consider anything other than the most direct and open approach to be dishonest and insincere, and that we quickly lose confidence in and distrust anyone who hints at what is intended. We are not a culture generally that values keeping your cards or your ideas close to your chest. That is seen as somebody who's scheming or somebody who isn't to be trusted. I should also explain that in this definition, honesty doesn't really mean telling the factual truth. It means speaking the truth as you know it. So I wouldn't say that Chief Joseph is necessarily a celebrity, but I wanted to give as broad a picture of American culture as possible. And he said that it does not require many words to speak the truth. This gets at the idea that directness is a sign of honesty. If you have something that's true, you should be able to say it briefly. If you are using a lengthy monologue or a lot of explanation or complicated reasoning, to Americans, that's a sign that you're trying to hide something, that you're trying to create a maze in which the listener will get lost.
We have a comment on that the levels of directness vary across the US as well.
This is also true, of course, yes. And what is appropriate to say directly also varies.
Okay.
Our second quote
There
about
is
direct.
if I may, Melissa, there is
Yes.
request. Could you go back to the first directness slide?
About the quote definition?
The one, it's Emily asking. Emily, let us know if that was the one definition. That's the one you wanted to see? The definition. So I'm guessing this one, yeah? Mm-hmm. Thanks. Okay, done.
Is that good?
Yeah, I guess somebody wanted to read it one more time. Mm-hmm.
And I also would add that we are exploring these values in terms of how politicians try to connect with voters. If you were engaging in a personal conversation with somebody that you had a relationship with, we might be framing some of these values a little bit differently. So the context also matters. Here we have a picture of Will Rogers, who is one of the earliest American celebrities, humorists, and actually he himself was a candidate for president. And he said, "Whoever wrote the 10 Commandments made them short. They may not always be kept, but they can be understood." This gets at the idea of American directness as speaking in plain language. So I understand that in some cultures you try to impress people by choosing precisely the right word and speaking in a very educated, elegant, elevated manner. This is not what most politicians would do in the United States. In general, we have an assumption that the obligation is on the speaker to make themselves understood. The job is not, it's not the job of the listener to elevate themselves to the level of the speaker. In fact, I can give you an example outside of politics. At some of the organizations that I've worked in the United States, in a communication role, we have had explicit instructions that we need to communicate at a 6th grade level, which is about 11 and 12 years old. There's a feeling that anything that's too highly educated might leave somebody out. So this also comes in with directness because the intention is that anybody can understand what you have to say.
Mm-hmm. We have one comment, if I may,
yes.
regarding the
Sure.
previous slides. So I will just read it. I might be wrong, yet could Chief Joseph's quote also be seen as an approach that is more high context and hence a bit less American as we understand it today?
I think we could also do that. So there's also a question of how we interpret the quotes as well, particularly because he's from Native American cultures. I think we could say that. That's a very interesting point. Thank you.
And there is, of course, little discussion going on American lawyers, but I don't know if we should be going into it. You know, the very typical comments on the lawyers using much longer contracts than lawyers in order to part of the world. So yeah.
So there's also a kind of rhetorical style that comes into play as well. There's a kind of pattern that American audiences are listening for in different contexts. Mm-hmm. So here we have examples of 2 candidates who were not successful in their bid for the White House. And I don't think that we can attribute their disappointment in not winning entirely to one value. Certainly there are many reasons that they were not successful. But I would say that part of their challenge was that both Mitt Romney, who ran against Barack Obama in 2012, and Hillary Clinton, who lost to Donald Trump in 2016, both struggled to communicate in a way that felt clear and authentic to a lot of ordinary people. And we have to remember, outside of the intercultural field, outside of our Zoom meetings, the vast majority of Americans do not have a college degree. And so they are listening for somebody who speaks to them and with them, but not somebody who speaks at them or who speaks over their heads with words that they don't know. And especially they're looking for somebody who doesn't speak down to them. It's important not to come across as condescending or patronizing. And this was a real struggle for Hillary Clinton. Again, we could really have an entire webinar or class on dissecting the 2016 election. And she had a difficult time, especially with the need to be direct as a woman and also to not sound patronizing. But I think the argument still holds that to people, especially in the middle of the country, they just really felt like she was talking down to them, like she thought she was superior. And that's a really easy way to alienate people in the US. Mitt Romney was a very qualified candidate. He had been a governor and a successful businessman, but he also stumbled. It was very clear that he had spent most of his time talking to people who were at his same intellectual and professional level. There's one scene that sticks out in my mind where he went home to his original state of Michigan, and he wanted to try to connect with people there. And he made a comment about how the trees were all the right height. And it was so odd, and it was an irrelevant thing to talk about. And it illustrated that he was struggling, and that just reminded people that there was a gap and that he wasn't able to really speak plainly without making an enormous effort. When we're talking about being direct, Americans are also looking for somebody who stakes out a clear position on an issue. Most of us mostly know that everything's not black and white, but in an election, we want somebody who can argue for their side, especially now when everything is so divided. Many Americans say that they want somebody who will be a uniter, but when they're voting, they're looking to see if their candidate can argue their point of view. It's very difficult for candidates who are equivocal, who are more moderate, because that looks wishy-washy. One of the candidates in the past who ran against George W. Bush, his name was John Kerry, and he got labeled a flip-flopper, somebody who thought this, and then he thought this, and then he changed his mind again. That was one of the most fatal blows to his campaign. It wasn't seen as a sign of somebody who's reflective and considering all the options. It was seen as somebody who didn't have a real opinion and who couldn't stick with it. It's also very important. Oh, go ahead, Agnieszka.
Yeah, there is a comment, so I would just say it regarding Barack Obama, that he speaks clearly yet sounds more sophisticated than many politicians. How do you explain that?
So my interpretation is twofold. Barack Obama communicated in a way that, to me, as somebody who grew up going to kind of a mainline Christian church, he spoke in a way that fit the template of a pastor, where you use language in a certain way, similar to Martin Luther King, to bring in a vision and to try to build some emotional response. The people who liked Barack Obama found that compelling. It was something that he was attacked for, though. People on the right called him the teleprompter president. They would groan. There were a lot of complaints. They would say, I can't listen to him talk. So this isn't necessarily going to be a candidate who's successful appealing to everybody. I liked the fact that Barack Obama was educated and that he was able to put sentences together. And he also was able to do it because he used ordinary language that people could understand, but did it in a really successful way. We also have a tradition of rhetoric and speech writing and kind of verbal communication. So it's not restricted to being direct, but it was clear what his opinion was. So he stated his opinion. You didn't have to wait for 20 minutes to find out where he was going.
I'll just add one more comment. There is, I guess, German and Austrian part of the participants are just commenting that directness of American people can be perceived differently regarding the culture you are representing. So yeah.
Yes, so obviously this is also relative compared to other cultures. Compared to Korea, we're very direct. Compared to maybe Germany and Austria or Israel, not so much. it's not about necessarily being blunt. We still have an etiquette that we should try to be nice when we make our statements, but it's about having clear thinking that other people can follow. So we also don't really appreciate people who have lengthy introductions, people who are very philosophical, people who give a lot of theory and background and really present the entire range of possibilities. You can also look at the way I started my presentation. I said hello, I had a poll, and then I got started. I didn't have a lot of exposition at the beginning, and this is the American interpretation of directness. The last point actually resonates with what people said about Obama. He was able to paint a compelling picture. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you only speak for 2 minutes and you're done, but it means that your point comes across at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. I will use this pause for a second just to remind you guys that when are you posting comments in chat, please make sure that in this blue little box is shown all panelists and attendees, because some of you are sending messages that only we, the panelists, so me and Melissa, can see, and the rest is losing a great insights. So make sure you have it checked. You can scroll it down and find all panelists and attendees.
Okay, so the fourth value that we're going to look at today is the action and work orientation. And Robert Kohls reminds us of an American expression: don't just stand there, do something. This is often used in a crisis situation, but in a sense, it describes most Americans' waking life. He also argues that action, any action, is superior to inaction. And I think that in general, this is a very American idea. There's pushback against it. Every person doesn't have this exact feeling all the time. But one example of it from just regular life outside of politics is that a lot of people were posting on social media in the past couple of months this question of, so what are you doing during the pandemic? What are you doing during lockdown? People from Europe asked me, how are you coping? How are you handling it? People in the US asked me, so what are you accomplishing? The idea was that if you weren't going to have some success or take care of some extra work during the pandemic, that you were wasting your time. There's also a fear, I think, of failing to act. So if I'm going to take a risk as an American, in general, I would rather make a choice and take an action and then later find out that it was a mistake, as opposed to sitting on the sidelines and letting the moment pass me by. Our first quote about action comes from Dolly Parton, who is a very famous country singer. And she says, if you don't like the road you're walking, start paving another one. You'll notice that she doesn't say, if you don't like the road you're walking, sit down and wait a while. She doesn't say, ask the government to change it for you. She doesn't say, blame your neighbor or your parents. The idea embedded in her quote is very American, and that's that ultimately, if you want to do something with your life, if you want to make a change, you need to go out and create it from nothing. And this is the idea of action as initiative and personal responsibility. Our other quote about action comes from Michael Jordan, who is one of the most accomplished American athletes of all time. And he says, some people want it to happen, some wish it would happen, and others make it happen. This gets at the idea of action being something that separates winners and losers. Competition and hard work are similar, are adjacent values in American culture. And we don't really benefit, we benefit economically from the status of our parents or connections that they might have for us, but we don't get any kind of cultural esteem because we come from a certain family line. We really still have this idea that we are what we do. We are only as good as our accomplishments and we're only as good as our most recent accomplishments. And so we are always driven to do more and more. And Michael Jordan would be an example of when that mindset really works out. So what does this look like in a political context? Well, candidates often will do their best to show the general public that they are very active and busy. One of the things that we often see that others have told me is very unique to the US is that we have a little bit of an obsession with seeing our presidents and presidential candidates doing some kind of exercise. So I don't know if that's ever the case in your country, but we frequently will see, less with Donald Trump, although he does play golf, but we would see Barack Obama playing basketball. We would see, here we have a picture of Ronald Reagan throwing the opening pitch at a baseball game. Partly, this is a way to connect with ordinary people and to also project the values of being informal and being casual and relatable, but it's also a way to demonstrate their physical and youthful vigor. We know that it's very strenuous to be a president, and so we need some kind of sign that the candidate has what it takes to handle that kind of grueling schedule. So playing some sports, going out for a run, it's a way to show that they are physically capable of the level of activity that being a president requires. In a typical campaign season, when we don't have a pandemic, we would also have a nonstop stream of activities with campaign buses going to pancake breakfasts in Iowa. You would see candidates flipping hamburgers in New Hampshire, then appearing at a factory, then getting back on the road again. Part of the campaign is obviously geared towards meeting real people and getting their vote. But if you pull back a little bit, it's also about being seen as being a busy person, about somebody who has a full schedule. I can't really think of an American candidate who has won by sitting in a chair and sort of just philosophizing about the nature of the human experience and political ideals. You have to be seen as somebody who's out there and is on the go constantly. With our emphasis on
I would just comment, because it seems we have right now a variety of examples how various presidents from various countries are proving their physical shape.
Okay.
So if you are looking for some additional examples from Korea, Russia, etc., just go to our chat and you will see many examples of how to present your strength as a presidential candidate or president.
So it's not unique to the US, even though it works very well in American culture. We also
somebody saying that Trump is calling Biden a sleepy Joe.
Yes. So this is the reason that it's really petulant name calling like you would see in elementary school. But the reason that it works is that it targets this value. And with both of our candidates being in their 70s, neither of them can really be as athletic at this point as Obama could, for example. So rather, they can't really go for that full exertion, especially Trump. So they try to attack each other's ability to do that. And as a similar example, one of the campaign videos for Joe Biden shows him kind of running up the stairs at a campaign event, and it contrasts that with a separate video of Donald Trump very slowly walking down a ramp. And the implication, of course, is that I've still got youthful energy, the other person doesn't. He's going to fall asleep, he's too old and too tired. Lastly, and this is probably similar for other countries, but it's especially important in the American kind of cultural perspective, is that candidates will highlight their past accomplishments, they will make promises for the future, and they will attack each other's record in those areas. So I wanted to spend a few minutes now in discussing specifically how each candidate signals these values that we've introduced today. When it comes to Donald Trump, he has really tapped into the equality value by positioning himself as a populist defender of real Americans, according to his narrow definition, versus the elites and globalization. His definition of equality is not equal rights for all, but it is an interpretation that is very American, that is about saying nobody is going to tell us what to do. When it comes to informality, he of course has his famous red baseball cap. He also has a bombastic and even cartoonish persona. It's very odd that his skin is orange. He has this strange haircut. He waves his arms in the air kind of like this. He makes very unique facial expressions. And the idea from a cultural perspective is that he is not going to constrain himself, kind of like Lady Gaga. He is not going to confine himself to a pre-existing template of what a politician or government leader is supposed to be or how he's supposed to behave. In directness, we can say that Donald Trump is successful in saying what he wants. Some have asserted that he speaks the silent part. And by that, they mean that a lot of people might have some part of the sentence in their head that they think, but they know that they can't say it because there'll be some kind of social consequence. For them, it's exhilarating to hear a politician say what they are thinking, but what they think they can't say themselves. I have heard interviews with voters, and not just a few of them, many of them have said, I really don't like his language. I really wish he would tone it down. But I also like that I know what he's thinking. And this gets back to the idea that we want somebody who is transparent or who appears to be transparent. So voters who like Trump find him appealing partially because of the cultural value that he's saying what he's saying and he's staking out a position, and he's really just, he's not hiding behind any kind of lofty or elegant prose. Mm-hmm. And finally, when it comes to action, he makes extraordinarily sweeping claims about his success. He says that he's the most successful businessman in the history of the world, that he had the greatest inauguration crowd ever in American history, that he, he's the best negotiator with China that the world has ever seen. For people who dislike Trump, this is a little bit of a joke because investigators have looked into these and they've found that many of these claims are exaggerations or are falsehoods or misinterpretations of events. However, he's not trying to reach people like me. He is trying to reach a very specific demographic that he would call his base, people who are inclined to support him or who already do support him. And those people aren't really concerned about the factual reality of his success. They want to be swept up in the aura and atmosphere and the idea of success, the idea of being behind a winner who's going to fight for them.
Mm-hmm. It may be a good time to just get the comment from Joe regarding the US value as stated in the Declaration of Independence is that all men are created equal, created underlined. This does not mean that society should be equal. People in the US above all believe that it is up to you to create wealth and power. So for yourself, and admire people who do. So most on the right and center believe that if you are poor, it's your own fault.
I would say that I would agree with that explanation, that the idea of equality on the right especially is that we all got here the same way and now it's up to you what you make of that opportunity, and that the government should get out of your way so that you can succeed. On the left, especially now, there is an idea that the government needs to be the one to kind of arbitrate equality in society, and that needs to actively construct a society that's more equal in outcomes.
Mm-hmm. There are a lot of comments, sorry guys, I cannot read all, but connected with the equality as long as you are white, middle class, male represented. Yeah.
So we want to look quickly about how Biden signals these same values. You notice the values are the same, but the way that he's embodying them and interpreting them is for a very different audience. When it comes to equality, Biden really emphasizes his working class roots from kind of an industrial town in Pennsylvania. He emphasizes the dignity of ordinary people. He says he uses the hard knocks or just kind of difficult times in life that he's had to overcome as a way to relate and understand that life doesn't always work out and life doesn't always go the way you intend. And so he uses his own experience as an entree to trying to relate to the equality of the people that he's interacting with. It is a little bit more difficult for him, though, in that Trump has a very specific audience. On his campaign website, he has, Latinos for Trump, Asian for Trump. But in general, he really has one audience. So he can have a very consistent message to appeal to that group. Biden is trying to reach the disaffected people in rural America, factory workers who don't have jobs anymore, farmers who are struggling, and he's trying to reach all the people who've been historically left out. And I think it's a little bit harder for him to have a message of equality that straddles those two narratives. Obama was able to do it, but I think it's a little bit harder in this era. When it comes to
10 minutes left, just an info, 10 minutes.
Perfect. Okay, so when it comes to informality, Biden leans on the podium, he appears without a tie, he rolls up his sleeves, he wears kind of aviator sunglasses. He is often also under directness. He says what he thinks too. He had some high profile gaffes during the Democratic primary. I think that that's a strength for him in the general election. He also calls out falsehoods by calling them malarkey. Malarkey is kind of an old-timey, folksy, I think maybe Irish American word that's really not used anymore, in a way that he can say something is a lie and also do it in a kind of friendly, egalitarian way. And finally, under action, Biden has a lot of accomplishments that he can highlight from his decades in Congress. He's a little bit vulnerable because he's been in office for so long that some of his previous decisions are no longer kind of standing the test of time, but he is able to point to actually having done things. And on his website, he outlines future policies. I just want to say one more thing and then make sure we have a few minutes for discussion, which is that I do think that Americans are have more in common when it comes to our values than we popularly understand it today. But I'm not sure that that's really enough to hold us together. I can't imagine talking to somebody on the other side of the political spectrum and saying, oh, you're informal, I'm informal. Okay, everything is fine now. The issue is not really these values themselves. It's that we have very different ideas of who the country is now, who we were in the past, and where we're going. We're also at a time when our country is under a lot of strain and stress. And so I think these values are a useful starting place, particularly for me as an intercultural professional, to try to understand what's going on and to see if we can identify what messages the candidates are projecting and why they're resonating. But I don't want to overstate how much we have in common, because clearly we are at a moment in our society where we are extremely divided. And I think all those divisions still exist, even if our values underneath are similar. And with that, Agnieszka, I want to make sure that we have a few minutes for some more comments. I see that we have quite a few marks in the chat.
Yeah. I found a question, so maybe let's start with that. So do Biden's policies really represent those who have been historically excluded from US prosperity?
I don't know, actually, if they will make a change. This has been a debate. The main source of division and disagreement in the Democratic Party was whether Biden would be a strong enough candidate on behalf of people who have been historically excluded. There is a fear by people who are farther on the left that he's too moderate. So I don't know if the policies are often more of a vision because they have to be passed by Congress. in terms of how our legal system works. So I don't know if the details would actually fix things. And that question gets to the feeling of really despair and the feeling of being disaffected that many Americans have, that they feel like they have a really important choice in the election, but they're not really sure that either candidate has the wherewithal to improve the situation.
Mm-hmm. And I also will come back to the question which was posted at the beginning of our meeting, but I guess it's now time when we can answer, because when we were polling, the question popped, why was Bernie not on the poll?
So I was thinking about candidates who are in the final running for president. And then I thought, well, I know that Obama was president and was popular overseas, but we could have included him. I didn't want it to get too long and too complicated, but I suppose it would be interesting to see if Bernie was a popular candidate abroad as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do we have any questions? I'm reading, scrolling. You are asking if it's possible to save chat. I will try to of course, to do it. I will do it, not I will try. So of course I will save the chat. Do we have any additional questions, guys?
While Agnieszka is searching, I'll just say, maybe I'll just say out of my own humility, I certainly want to admit that this is not a comprehensive or exhaustive dissection of American culture or our political system by any means. It's a very short introduction to one way that I think we can try to understand the political situation, but we only had time for a few examples. And I also am not in a position where I can speak for all Americans. So I would hope that you won't stop with this presentation. If this is a topic that interests you, I encourage you to go beyond what I said today and talk to other Americans who may have very different opinions than I do and very different reference points and very different ways of expressing them. I wanted to give you something that you could maybe use to have new insights and to kind of explore it from a different angle, but certainly the conversation is much bigger than a presentation in 1 hour.
Maybe one more question that I see. Do you see a big difference between people outside the US and people in the US in who they see as appropriate to be president?
I do, and one short example I can give is when I was living in Poland in 2007, one of my classmates who was Polish, at one point she said to me, "So, do you think Hillary is going to win?" And we hadn't even had the primary yet, and Obama ended up being the candidate. And I was really surprised because based on the US that I lived in, the people that I knew, not even my own opinion about worthiness, but the attitudes that I have, I thought there was no way she was in that year, she was going to have that kind of popularity. And I could tell that my Polish counterpart was approaching the subject from the perspective of who is most competent, who is most qualified, whereas many Americans are approaching the topic from the angle of who do I like, which person do I want to be friends with. And I think this is a very important cultural difference. You notice none of the values that I mentioned had anything to do with actual qualifications. We aren't really looking for somebody who has a certain number of years of experience, who has a certain intellectual capacity. I mean, certainly for me, I would like to see some of those things. But for Americans in general, it is in a sense a popularity contest, just like we would have in junior high school, not so much about who is up to the task.
Well, that is a bit maybe answer to one last question that was popped up. Why is it that women still do not get the opportunity to become president in this time and day? So I guess a bit partially that could be answer to this question, what you just said.
And I know that we're short on time, but I do want to say that an important consideration that we have to keep in mind is the Electoral College. You know, we have a certain system and certain rules, and everybody who voted in 2016 kind of knew that we had the Electoral College. That's the way the system works. But especially for people on the left who are very disappointed by Hillary Clinton's loss, they have not forgotten that she won the total votes. She got more votes in the country than Donald Trump did, but the votes were not in the right states. And so by the system that we have, I think there's a feeling that it can be very difficult for somebody to appeal to the right people in the right states so that they get the votes that they need. I really hope that we'll have a female candidate. I think that Hillary and Elizabeth Warren and other people who have run have shown just how difficult it is to pull off the twin challenges of being direct enough but likable enough. And those areas of American culture really seem to present tripwires for female candidates in particular.
Obviously, the chat just went crazy with comments, with the number of comments, of course, and just people are saying that there should be a follow-up webinar after the elections, and then we could discuss more about what is being right now raised as important comments. So yeah, I will save the chat. So I will ask our team to send you the chat so you could read all the elements, as our time is already, gone. Melissa, would you like to have a last sentence? That would not sound good. Yeah.
A final word.
Final word.
I would just like to thank all of you again for your attention today and your thoughtfulness and your participation. I wasn't able to follow the chat as well as Agnieszka was, but I can see that it was very active. I hope that I've given you some new ways to think about the political process and that you'll have something that you can take with you. I too would be very interested in having this conversation after the election, although I have to admit that as an American, I feel a lot of anxiety and trepidation, so we'll have to see what kind of state we're all in after November. But I wanted to just thank you again, and thank you to Agnieszka for making today happen.
Thank you so much. I'll, of course, invite you to the next meeting webinar, but also to our anti-racism webinar, which is also upcoming this month, looking at the comments. It seems that you could be interested in such participation. Thank you so much. Thank you, Melissa. It was absolutely lovely.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.